Well, good afternoon, everyone, or perhaps on the West Coast it's good morning. But welcome. I'm seeing a number of new faces here today in our audience, and it's a pleasure. If you can see on the screen, a number of different individuals joining us from right across the country. So, welcome to this ASA Brown Bag Lunch. This talk with Frank Robinson. We're so pleased to be able to have Frank with us today. Frank, welcome. And Frank is a new member with us in the ASA, and new to us, and certainly new to me. He has a unique academic background, military training. I think you have seen in his biographical sketch what that background is. It includes graduating from the Naval Academy, Marine Corps service, as a combat veteran internationally. He's a recent seminary graduate in both theology and in counseling. And Frank has applied for medical school. Frank, any news there yet on medical school? You can just say yes or no. Oh, yes, there is. Okay, when we get to the Q&A, folks, something to look forward to. He's going to give us an announcement about that. So that's good news. We've been anticipating. But today, his topic is actually a unique perspective that we haven't, I had not heard about or even thought about before. So let me introduce Frank's talk to you today this way. I want to set the context, for these insights into the concept of asymptomatic racism, an interesting term. First, this is an interesting locution that will not be familiar to most of us. Frank is pushing our intellectual boundaries here. He's helping us to understand and to think, or actually to reimagine things that sit hidden just beneath the surface of our consciousness. The meaning of this phrase, asymptomatic racism, it comes out of his life story. And we have a part of that story as actually being lived out in the inspired writings of his father. In fact, these are actually, when I read them, love letters. It seems to me that his father was writing to him right at his birth. In his father's book, Letters to a Mixed Race Son, we can listen in as Frank was growing up and as some of these experiences. So here on January 1st, 1991, his dad writes, "Dear son, tonight you ask if one of us in the family is white. I told you yes. And then you asked me, who is it? I was praying inside my heart, and instead of directly speaking to you, I had your mother come and sit next to me." Now, notice Frank is 5 years old when this is happening. "You looked at us for a while, first one and then the other, back and forth, and then declared, 'Oh, you're the one.' Those are more or less your words." This gives us some insight into Frank and into his family. And I would urge you to, I'm going to actually hold this up. I would urge you to pick up a copy of his dad's book. Oh, there we go. I see one. And there we go. And it's a great read and really inspirational. I think this is you see the pastor's heart of your dad in this book. It's just great. So after Frank does this talk, we're going to listen to his talk that was given at the Gordon-Conwell ASA student chapter this fall. We're going to listen to that talk, and then Frank will come back and we'll have a Q&A time together. During that Q&A time, we'll have the opportunity either to enter a question in the chat, or we'll take the chance today and unmute, and you can raise your hand, unmute yourself, and I'll call on you individually for your questions. So that'll happen in the Q&A after we listen to Frank and his talk from September 11th here to the students at the Gordon-Conwell or Gordon College chapter. So let's listen to Frank's talk.
Hoping to make at least some contribution to everyone being okay by engaging with the ongoing topics of both COVID-19 and systemic racism. I'm going to compare those two and integrate concepts from biology, from theology, and from sociology to see what we can glean from our knowledge of how a virus works, to talk about how systemic racism works and what we might do about it, hopefully to come up with some protective measures we can take. I don't imagine we'll come up with a vaccine tonight. We'll just sort of kick off the discussion. But we'll see where this goes. Before I do, I want to give a little bit of background about myself, and thank you, Vicki, for the kind introduction. As some background about me, let me see, how do I share this? There we go. I am a black and white biracial male, and so definitively, I'm usually identified as black and identify as such, but I'm of mixed racial heritage. My father, who's in attendance, is a white man who married my mother, a black woman, in Alabama in 1984. At the time, that was about as socially unacceptable as could be. Lynchings were, in fact, the norm back then. It was part of the air they breathed. They received threats of lynching. And in 1985, when I was due to be born, my parents fled to Florida, where it was deemed a little bit less likely that a quote-unquote complication would kill me and my mother. My family later moved to Los Angeles area in California, where my father was one of few white clergy members in a predominantly black church during the 1992 riot. And so the racialized environment of the United States has been a very important part of my upbringing. Pictured on the screen is a book that my father wrote of letters to me. He wrote those basically with the idea that, considering the trend of his life, he might be doing some parenting in absentia. And so he wrote letters to try to help me to integrate my own identity and figure out who I was going to be in this racialized country, while not fitting neatly into one racialized category. The rest, I think, Vicki covered quite well. Went to the Naval Academy, served in the Marine Corps, including a couple deployments. Intended to come back in to active duty as a chaplain after seminary, but was massively distracted by some clinical experiences and worked in psychology, of which Karen Mason was a very large part. She's also in attendance. And redirected towards medical school with a goal of becoming a psychiatrist one day. So that is part of how all these ideas got mashed up in a really mixed up head, that it was currently studying theology and psychology. And so we have on our hands a tale of two viruses. COVID-19, which currently in the United States, we have 2.3 million cases and nearly 180,000 deaths from COVID-19, and systemic racism, which has plagued our country for about 400 years. I'm certainly not the first person to make the comparison between these two pandemics, but I think they're not only rhetorically connected, they're directly connected in some way. As a chilling similarity, there are about 2.3 million persons incarcerated in our country at the moment. And the majority of both of those, people affected by COVID-19 and people affected by mass incarceration, are people of color. If you're black in the United States, you have twice the likelihood of being infected with COVID-19 and dying of COVID-19, and over 5 times the likelihood of our white population of being incarcerated. People of my age, black males of my age, have 5 times the likelihood of being imprisoned during their life as the rest of our population does. So with that being said, on June 6th at a rally in Salem, I was speaking there in support of racial justice. I compared these two, and I said that all of our lives were more vulnerable to COVID-19 because some of them were. Because that disproportionate contagion among people of color, not contagion, infection rate, has affected all of us in that we were all more vulnerable to the spread of this disease as a result of that. And so what are the structural factors that influence both? I think we see something that, as the story is told of why the United States is the undisputed worst at dealing with COVID-19 and also has the highest rate of incarcerated persons in the world, I think they're very much connected. So what I hope to do as we go along is explore some of those connections and maybe what we can do about it. We mentioned Francis Collins earlier. I think that's an important point, is that theology has incorporated themes from so many different fields, most notably from law. Calvin was a lawyer. Charles Finney was a lawyer, and integrated concepts from their fields into the field of theology. And I think we have plenty of biblical warrant to do so with medicine as well. Francis Collins' book, The Language of God, is one great example, I think, of that being done, but it hasn't been done enough. I think that when we look through Scripture, we see sin often compared to sickness. We have in the book of Isaiah, by his wounds we are healed. Jeremiah, is there no balm in Gilead? We have in Jesus' career throughout it him healing people and saying things like, go and sin no more, lest the worst thing come upon you. And I think the greatest comparison of sin to sickness is this idea of all throughout Scripture. When someone had a skin infection, or they had a boil, or they had some sort of thing that made them unclean, when they were sick, they had to go outside the camp and declare themselves unclean, be separated from their people. They talk about a stigma, right? Well, we have Jesus, who then goes outside the camp and is crucified outside the camp with them to invite the people who are outside back in. So the author of Hebrews says, therefore, let us go with him outside the camp and bear his disgrace. For we have no continuing city here, but we seek the city that is to come. So Jesus is the healer of our disease because he went to the outside, to the people who were outside, and took the disease upon himself. So I'm going to acknowledge that what I'm about to do will take the metaphor of sin and sickness further than any of the biblical authors intended. None of them knew about a virus. They didn't know about molecules or anything like that, but we believe that none of the discoveries of science are surprises to the ultimate author of Scripture, which is the Lord. And so I think it's fruitful and also warranted to reflect on, well, if sin is a sickness, what are the symptoms? And are there always symptoms? And perhaps if we could qualify sin as disease, could racism be maybe a strain of sin? And if so, like other strains of viruses, could certain strains of sin be destroyed? Could they be defeated? Can we come up with a cure? Certainly medicine hasn't been able to cure death, but it has been able to eradicate some diseases. Smallpox is nothing compared to what it used to be in the world. And so maybe we can do something about this disease of systemic racism. So I'm going to begin our reflection of various things from biology to see what we can gather from it. And the first topic I'd like to bring in is the idea of a retrovirus. What a retrovirus does is essentially it transcribes itself into the DNA of its host such that it's indistinguishable from the host. The immune system can't distinguish it from the host cells, and the virus is essentially impossible to kill without destroying the host cells. So this is part of why HIV is so pernicious, for example, because you can't really help somebody who has it, or at least it's more treatable now, but you couldn't really help someone who has it without killing that person. And so it's really difficult to treat. So just imagining something that infected you so deeply that it essentially became a part of you, inseparable from you, and impossible to kill or get rid of without killing you. I would argue that sin works this way. It inscribes itself into the nature of every human person and is passed to every human offspring. And if you think of it like that, it's not so surprising that the cure for it would come from the DNA of the one man in human history who wasn't infected by it, the blood of Jesus Christ. Another thing I would like to bring in, another idea from biology, is the idea of a lytic and lysogenic life cycle. And this isn't directly comparing to COVID-19, but maybe if you haven't come across this in maybe your beginning classes of biology, you come across it from time to time when a cold sore comes up or something like that. What the lytic phase is when the virus is reproducing in such a way that it has no regard for the survival of the host cells. So you get a blister, you get an immune response, you get symptoms, and it's what we call virulent in that phase. It is not as counterintuitive as it might seem, the desired way of working for the virus. What they would rather do, since it's not really a team win to destroy one's own host, if you're a virus, is to operate beneath the notice of the host organism in such a way that it's not attracting immune response, it's not producing noticeable symptoms, and you might never even know it's there if it continued to operate in that state. And what does that sound like? Well, I think sin in general, as we understand it from Scripture, sometimes is overtly destructive, and we can see it, and we can put our finger on it, and we can come up with laws that outlaw it and discourage it and keep it at bay. But other times it's internal, and it's something that maybe we can't see, like hate, like lust, like maybe things that do have a destructive quality but operate and thrive in silence and secrecy, pornography, sexual predation, things like that. And I think we're getting to a place where we can understand how racism might work, sometimes with overt symptoms and sometimes with things that may not escape our notice. To go one step deeper, in the 1960s, everyone knew that racism was a problem. It was really symptomatic. There were dogs, there were fire hoses, there were people hanging from trees and being burned. And the publicity of that was very shocking to a lot of people. And nobody needed to be convinced that it existed, not only at an individual level, but at a state-sanctioned level in the structures of our society that needed to change. I would ask, as a question, did that go away with the signing of civil rights legislation, such as the Civil Rights Act? Or did it just adopt a more lysogenic phase in a way that it operates beneath our notice? I would argue that the strain of sin we call racism does have a lytic and lysogenic phase, that it does sometimes operate in ways that we can see in flags and in acts of hate, and in some ways that we can't see. The water that we swim in our culture that is harmful to people in ways that sometimes escape our notice. So Peggy McIntosh, who coined the term white privilege, says that one factor that seems clear about all these interlocking oppressions is that they have active forms which we can see and embedded forms which, as a member of the dominant group, one is taught not to see. In the interest of time, I'm going to keep moving. But this is that idea of systemic racism. So one might ask, no symptoms, no problem, right? If we just treat the symptoms when they arrive and when they don't show up, not worry about it, what is the problem with that? I would think if we can describe the obvious symptoms of racism as lynching, forms of violence, racial slurs, and things like that, we might also note that there are destructive properties that operate in the absence of those symptoms, such as stereotypes that can be harmful, implicit bias that can be harmful, particularly in policing or in hiring, objectification, privilege, presumption of criminality, being followed around in the store if you've ever had that experience, and microaggression. Those are ways that racism could operate asymptomatically and spread asymptomatically. So one of the problems I think that we have with this term systemic racism, and some people may raise this, is that it comes off as this conspiracy theory. Like there's some great conglomerate government organization whose sole purpose is to persecute minority groups at every end. And I think when described that way, it seems ridiculous. Like no such thing exists, right? Most people are trying to do a good job in government, and I think we can have good faith in that in general. But if we described it like this, like an infection, in an infection, you can have localized symptoms, a wart or a blister or something like that. That's treatable. You can get rid of the thing and be better. Put some cream on the rash and you're okay. But you also have infections that spread to the rest of the body. Now you have muscle aches, you're having trouble breathing, etc. And this is the debate, particularly when it comes to policing, of whether we're dealing with a few bad apples in our system that, when they do something horrible, they go to jail, right? No problem, end of story. Or is there a problem with the system that maybe started out with a few infected cells, but then spreads as it does in the body to the respiratory system, to the nervous system, or by comparison, to the healthcare system, the education system, to the legal system. So no giant conspiracy, but something that becomes a matter of not only individual hate, but a problem with our society. Another scientific way to look at it would be in terms of research, and the difference between random error and systemic error. Random error is human error. It's a mistake or something that went wrong in your experiment. If you've been in lab and you've made one of those, you can correct the error and move on, and your experiment is still valid. But with systemic error, you have a problem with the plan. And the experiment is not going to work, the research is not going to be valid unless you correct the problem with the plan. So when we describe systemic racism, we're describing a problem with the plan, with how our society works. It's not just a matter of individual errors, because it's so consistent and so predictable and so common that we recognize that if we change the plan, we might be able to change the situation. If we don't change the plan, we're going to continue to have this situation. So perhaps a more non-threatening and less ridiculous way to think about systemic racism. As another topic from biology that I'd like to bring in is cell recognition and antigen. All of our cells have proteins or glycoproteins or other molecules on the surface that facilitate recognition. Bacteria have them, and we have them. And so when our cells are infected by a virus, an infected cell may present at the surface, say this is an antigen, something like this, and say, if you see this, calling out to the immune system, this is what's killing us. Attack it. It's the enemy. And we develop antibodies for that thing. Our blood types work this way as well. If you have type A, you have type A antigen, say that's the yellow one. If you have type B blood, you have type B antigen. If you have type B blood and your body perceives, or type A blood and you perceive type B antigens in your blood, your body goes, whoa, that's not part of us. That's not a part of our body. We need to get rid of it. And I think that we can say racism operates in a similar way, that there's a very superficial something that is different, that is recognized. And whether intentionally or unintentionally, consciously or unconsciously, at the individual or at the systemic level, there's a hostility or a fear to that something that's different. This isn't one of us. This isn't like us, and can result in harming that person or attacking that difference. And there's a depreciated recognition of those things that are the same and do mark people that are different as part of the same body. So a body that fails to recognize part of itself and attacks other cells that's part of the same body is such as an autoimmune disease. And I think if we're classifying systemic racism as a virus, we can say that it produces an autoimmune response. And this is why it's deadly, because some parts of our same body, of our same society, are being destroyed because they're not recognized as part of us and not something that is for. This is particularly ironic, as it's common in the evangelical Christian community, because we have this belief in the image of God, the Salem Elohim. And that's the thing, right? That's the thing in every human person that marks us as similar, as part of the same body and part of the same act of creation. It connects us all. So if we're looking for commonality, it should be really easy to find in the Christian faith, the image of God, common to all humankind. So the point of all this, of reflecting on different things we can take from biology into our study of how racism works, is the same way we study viruses in pursuit of a cure or a treatment. Understanding how this works can help us to figure out ways to combat it. And I think a couple we've just suggested. perhaps if we are unable to identify symptoms of racism, if we don't see what is the problem with our society, is this overblown, then we could look to the antigen-presenting cells, those who are saying, this is what's killing us. This is the problem. We can't breathe. If you see this, make it stop. And then we make that thing stop, right? That could be part of how we deal with our problem with racism, is listening to those voices that are actually heard by it. Another implication is this, that perhaps we can learn to recognize what is common between us. Those proteins, so to speak, or those things about us that mark us as part of the same body, or the us that is in them and the them that is also in us. And this is essentially the premise of what sociologists call contact theory. Contact theory, in its simplest form, is the idea that meaningful contact between groups on equal terms in an environment that reinforces equality rather than disparity necessarily will reduce tension or animosity between those groups. It will improve the relationship between those groups. It has been found in studies to reduce racial animosity. And I want to be careful to not sell this as a panacea to racism, but these environmental factors, this sort of contact, has been found to reduce racism. It's hard to maintain our stereotypes, for example, when they're disconfirmed by meaningful contact. In other words, contact could be a way to see the us in them and the them that is also in us. So we have our tale of two viruses, one that is spread by contact and mitigated by social distance, that is the talk of the town these days, and why we're having this conversation virtually. And one that is mitigated by contact and promoted by social distance, that the distance between us economically and between neighborhoods and in other ways, the lack of meaningful contact allows systemic racism to thrive. And so I just offer that as whenever COVID-19 comes to its inevitable conclusion, we can go about our lives the way we used to, Lord may be. Let's keep in mind that the distance between us socially can cause systemic racism to thrive, and we can combat it by closing some of that distance and developing meaningful relationships. And if not, the Bible gives us some safeguards, I would say, when we can't identify the common image in people who are other than ourselves, is that it tells us exactly how people who are different are to be treated. In Exodus, you have God saying that you shall not oppress the sojourner in your land, because you know the heart of the sojourner. You were sojourners in Egypt. In Leviticus 19, the same chapter that Jesus quotes when he talks about the second greatest commandment, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. It says in that same chapter, you shall love the stranger who sojourns with you as the native in your land. You should love him as you love yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Literally says, you will love the immigrant as you love yourself. You must love the refugee as you love yourself. You must love the person who is different from you, who dwells with you, as your neighbor, as you love yourself. These are the words of our Lord. In Psalm 39, the psalmist says, hear my prayer, O Lord, and listen to my cry for help. Do not be deaf to my weeping, for I dwell with you as a foreigner, a stranger, as all my ancestors were. Jesus overtly identifies with the outsider when he says, inasmuch as you did it to the least of the poor, the naked, the sick, those in prison, you did it unto me. As much as you did not do it to the least of these, you did not do it unto me. And so we can sort of imagine any demographic in there, whether it's women, whether it's refugees, whether it's immigrants. Inasmuch as you did not do it to the least of these, you did not do it to me. And finally, I think Luke 16 gives us a great lens to look at the idea of privilege. Often I've heard that word bandied about as a way to almost make people feel guilty for being white, which I don't think is very helpful. And it's not wrong to be white or make people implicitly racist for being white. And I think instead of a matter of guilt, we could look at it simply as a matter of stewardship. Jesus tells a story of a servant who has misused his master's funds and he's about to be fired. And realizing that, he goes around and takes stock of his situation and says, well, this unjust gain is going to be taken from me. I'm going to go make some friends with it. And so he says, hey, you take your debt and make it from 100 into 80. And take yours and make it from 100 into 50. And Jesus commends this servant in the parable, saying that we should make friends with our unrighteous mammon, that when it's taken away, we may be welcomed into an everlasting home. And so the question for all of us, because all of us have unjust gain and all of us have ill-gotten privilege, what do we do with it? Do we use it to advance justice or to make for ourselves friends in an everlasting kingdom, or do we use it for our own benefit? And how will it be for us when we stand in front of our judge in eternity, who was the oppressed every time? Did we do that to him, or are we welcomed into an everlasting home because of the way we've used it? So just as a point of reflection and something to think about, I think that's a good biblical lens rather than just sort of being beaten by the guilt that comes with our history or our privilege. So in closing, I would say that we're all sojourners in this world as our fathers were. We're all strangers. This world is not our home. And so how do we treat the strangers who are here? We all have ill-gotten gain. How do we use it? Do we use it to root out injustice? Do we use it to mitigate the suffering caused by this pandemic of our own treasure? So that's all I've got for you tonight. I've got some resources. I would encourage you to take a screenshot of this if you would like. Just to highlight a couple that are great for further reading. Gordon Alport's The Nature of Prejudice has shown up in almost every bibliography that I found in my research on prejudice and racism. Everyone points back to him, and I picked it up for myself, and it's an absolute gem. James Baldwin, if you want to get into the ideas behind what it does to a person to get to the point of violence, of rioting, I think it's an insightful read. He espouses a nonviolent approach, but certainly calls out the hypocrisy in insisting on a nonviolent response to violent oppression of people who are in a country that was founded on violent resistance to oppression of a lesser sort. So, as my old physics professor would say, put that in your smoke and pipe it. An excellent read and very well written. Some others here I think you'll enjoy. And a second page, if you're capturing the screen, if you like numbers, second from the bottom there, divided by faith. It's a little dated at the moment, but you have a sociologist who's crunched the numbers on how racism develops in the Christian church, namely in terms of the homogeneous unit principle and how we isolated in disparate groups in order to grow churches that were similar and thereby promoted racism between those groups and other sorts of prejudice. Highly encourage you to read that. And with that, I would like to open the floor for questions. And I have some questions for reflection here, unless anyone has any questions for me.
Very good, Frank. I know we're hearing a recording of you, but for a moment there, I just felt like you were talking right to us again here, even though that was a couple of months ago. And wonderful to hear those words again. We have some questions coming in, and we will begin to take those. Just to remind you, you can enter questions into the chat. You can use the everyone function there is what pops up, and everyone will see the questions. And I'll make my way down through some of those. We've got, I see we're just past the half-hour mark here, so we have certainly got 15 or 20 minutes easily that we can spend in this conversation. And I also notice Robert Chiara has put in a personal story in there. Thanks, Bob, for doing that. All of us, I think, are taking a kind of trip down memory lane here. I'm looking across the audience, and there's those of us who are thin on the top and white on the top. And then, that all tells me that 1960 is not that far and 65 is not that far away. We lived that experience, Frank. And yeah, I think the stunning thing that has happened, certainly to me personally, I'm sure to all of us, is that I thought that was behind us. I thought we dealt with that stuff. And yeah, we've got some cleanup work and we need to do a little bit better, but we're over that. And that has really been quite striking. So I'm going to stop talking and start asking some questions here. And in particular, I was thinking, Frank, there was one that had come in. Let's see if I can speed up. Steve Hall put this up, and he says, first of all, saying thank you, very interesting. And so he wants to riff off this idea that systematic infections and the idea of surgery or local intervention added the notion of, shall we jail the bad cop? Shall we defund the police here in this spot? May not work. So what is the antibiotic or the antibody or the combination with some reduced reaction to medicine that is needed? And I asked that one first because, Frank, you also put something in response saying that I think, and others are saying this too, it's not up to the individuals who are being maligned to correct the problem. The problem lies with the causative agent, not with the person that's being impacted. So what would you say to that? What's the antibody? What's the response we should have?
Yeah, excellent question. Thanks so much. I would love to say that I have a cure in mind or something that's going to fix it. That's unfortunately not the case. But I think in general, we can think of it this way, that a systemic problem requires a systemic solution. So, for example, if we have something that's more than just a few bad apples, if we have a system that's not working, then what can we do structurally to change that? And so I'd be talking about legislation, I'd be talking about social programs and things of that nature. Just as a couple of examples, right now, the taxpayers are paying for the settlements when a police officer murders somebody in their neighborhood. Mm-hmm. Just think about that for 2 seconds and how totally nonsensical it is that those things, sure, there should be a settlement to the family, but that's being paid for by that family's taxes. As a counselor, as a newly graduated counselor, I'm required to have my own liability insurance. And maybe a similar model could increase accountability for policing. If it was personally costly to commit malpractice, that discourages malpractice in a way that doesn't when the doctor can shrug his shoulders and say the taxpayers will pay for that. So that might be one example. As another, I think that to use myself again in therapy, I've got to use evidence-based approaches. As a society, we have yet to adopt an evidence-based approach to criminal justice. That is something that actually decreases the instance of crime and recidivism in a way that incarcerating individuals has notoriously not done. So I think that definitely needs to be reevaluated. Any number of things could be suggested. I think affirmative action was one approach, certainly very controversial one. But how do you get at the downstream effects that are still ongoing for a generation that wasn't allowed to purchase homes and wasn't allowed to participate equally in the workplace, et cetera? And so that line of questioning, I think, is very fruitful and necessary. But I don't think there's going to be any one panacea to sort of solve this. I think it's something we need to think through as a society.
Right. Thank you, Frank. That's very penetrating because it's a structural problem, and there are structural answers, not just individual answers. It's
Yes.
not just that I'm a nice person. If we're caught in the midst of it, you can't rise out of the kind of structural system that you're in, and it's challenging. You mentioned prison, and that's an interesting. You mentioned up front. You mentioned in your answer right now. And my mind goes away because the scriptures you were using from Leviticus and Deuteronomy that talk about the alien also talk about the fatherless and the widow. And we have known for a generation that our prisons are the place where orphans go in this society. Orphan men end up in prison disproportionately out of the society. And we see that and now that's been racialized, especially as over the last 30 years or so with our legal system. So we have some structural things there that can be addressed about how we incarcerate, and 3 strikes are out and all of that discussion. But individually, I think we have some opportunities here as well. Prison fellowship comes to mind as a ministry here in Canada and elsewhere, man-to-man program. These are places which individuals can volunteer and work, where you may not feel like you can do the structural thing at society and be involved in governance, but you can be involved in some direct action that makes a difference in the lives of an individual. Kind of like the story of the little girl on the sea shore and the starfish. There's hundreds of them there, and she's throwing one at a time back in the ocean. The man says, "What are you doing?" She says, "Oh, I'm throwing them back." She says, "There's so many. It won't matter." And the little girl looks and says, "It matters to this one," and sends it off. And ultimately, we are called to be faithful and to serve the person and the people that are in front of us. So thanks for that encouragement. I don't see a hand raised. If you have a live question, you could do that and unmute. If not,
John, Bob Kaida has his hand raised.
oh, thank you. Bob, just go ahead and unmute and ask.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I apologize in advance for my rather long response or my long comment, but I just wanted to say that in a way, thank you for expressing all of this, because it brought up a lot of things in my own life, especially in this area of not looking at me, considering, being considered by society at large as someone who has been subject to systematic but hidden racism, and in future generations of my own family, having this as a real concern. And so in a way, I wrote this in my message, but I thank you for your response that you just gave, because somehow as a victim, you have the sense that it's your responsibility. Well, keep up the good fight, especially as a Christian.
Yeah.
But I'm only human, and you can only do so much. And that's why I appreciated the answer really that you had to my question, which was that then we have to then somehow think of how we can be salt and light and leaven. Mm-hmm. And so just want to say thank you for that.
Yeah, and thank you, Robert, for your comment and for your question. You also brought up something with me that I've quite honestly left out of this presentation. What I've talked about is largely a metaphor for the society as a whole, and talking about, when I use the metaphor of a retrovirus, I'm talking about how it inscribes itself into the DNA of the society. But what you've brought up, I think, is a very important point and also fits very well with this idea, in that it's traumatic, and that has an effect on the individual who's traumatized by it, and that in a way that literally ceases to be a metaphor and becomes a reality is inscribed in the DNA of the person who's affected by it. It does pass on to the children of the person who is infected by it, both by their behaviors and by whatever epigenetic sort of changes occur in that individual. The trauma itself is inscribed in the individuals who are affected by it. So I've just finished reading a couple of books that are pertinent to this issue. One of them is Bessel van der Kolk's book on the body keeps score. And that talks about how trauma affects the individual and how that works out in their health and other symptoms and in their lives and possible addiction, and in their children's lives and their children's lives. A second book that sort of uses that to tie into the racial conversation is Sheila Wise Rowe's Healing Racial Trauma. And that talks about how the experience of racism is in fact traumatic and produces the same exact effects that trauma does in other contexts in the individuals affected by it. So I really appreciate you bringing that up. If anyone would like to read those, I highly recommend both of those books to talk about how racism as trauma affects the people who are subject to it and how that affects their lives.
And if I could make just a brief follow-up comment on that, to make a fine point on this. I was raised by parents who then say, stay out of sight. Don't study Japanese. Don't in any way affirm your identity because you're going to be discriminated against. And that actually was a hindrance for me to even consider a career in science. I had to overcome that. And so in that sense, that's why 96% of the Asian Americans were foreign born. We didn't have that trauma. And me as the 4% are as underrepresented for people experiencing trauma as African Americans, Black folks and Hispanics. So thank you very much for that insight.
Yeah, very welcome. Thank you, Robert.
Bob, you've gone right to the heart of what ASA is about and thinking about is how do we prepare the next generation of scientists, the natural and social sciences. And that's a huge challenge for us. And I'm connecting right now is when we talk about the STEM pipeline and high quality personnel and mentoring people, we don't think in this terms. It's asymptomatic. It doesn't come to our mind that that's a critical, how we've been raised, the context, how we think about ourselves is really an important, probably the first starting question. I know the pastor came alongside of me when I was in high school, and I'm thinking about post-traumatic stress disorder. My father coming back from World War II, he just wasn't present for us in lots of ways. So my pastor came along, put his arm around me essentially, and said, we need men like you in the ministry. You need to go to a Christian college university. I wouldn't have had the career if that hadn't happened. So this history, this personal history is really important. Don't see another hand. I've got a question here from Mark. He says he notices the similarity of what you're saying and what skeptics like Richard Dawkins have said about memes. He and others like him describe religion as a virus of the mind. We disagree with him about religion, of course, but Mark says, I wonder if you thought about what he has to say about memes in relation to what you're saying. Can asymptomatic racism become a meme in our society? I don't know.
Yeah, I can't say I'm familiar with the memes that he's talking about. I am familiar with Richard Dawkins on a very general level, but I don't know what those specific things are. But I think there's a potential for things to get minimized into a bumper sticker or a meme or something like that. No. If that's what he's speaking about, then yes, there's totally that potential. I think the legitimate argument behind the defunding the police is lost in the overstatement that, of course it's not going to work if we don't have funding for police. And that turns people off and it scares people, and the entire depth of that conversation can be bypassed because it's reduced to that bumper sticker, the one phrase, soundbite or whatever it is. Everyone in this room right now is familiar with that political tactic to minimize and misstate something and then dismiss it out of hand without engaging with that actual topic. We've seen that over and over from whatever side of the political aisle you're on. So I'm aware of that maneuver. I'm aware that it works, and it could work just as well with this. But I challenge you to actually think and engage with these topics. And do I know how to make it proof? Meme proof? No, I don't. I think that can be done in a way that any number of harms can just be done.
We have a question here from John Fotenhauer asks this: how do you see the picture that Paul describes in Galatians 3:28 neither Greek nor Jew. I think penetrating into our society. It's taking that notion of the image of made in the image of God, right? And how does that penetrate? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's an incredible question, and it's one that strikes two different notes for me. One, as a beautiful picture of what heaven looks like, a place where every nation and every tribe is gathered. However, there isn't a distinction between them in terms of value or status or position or anything like that. In heaven, there's neither Jew nor Greek, nor male nor female, nor slave nor free. All are one in Christ Jesus. However, I think taking that aspirational or that eschatological view and applying it to the here and now is problematic in this way. Is that creates the ideal of a colorblind society that may dismiss the reality that's admittedly artificial. Racism is a social construct. It's not an essential quality of human beings. But I think if we tried to make it, just assume it away, I think we dismiss the experience of people who are different and the reality that difference has consequences in our society that we need to look at.
Is there another question? I see a hand there. Unmute yourself.
This is Jack. I thoroughly appreciate your analog, if it's fair to call it that. When you were speaking about social distancing, I was distracted and I realized, hey, maybe that was an important point. I want to go back and retouch on it. I think one of the fellows already responded to my chat question by saying your point was in immunology, it's just the opposite of it is in racism. Racism requires, to mitigate it, requires close contact, whereas virology, pathology does not. It's the opposite. So I accept that, and it's good, it's powerful, but does that not sort of undermine your whole analog that works like a virus on the one hand, but in the case of transmission, it works the opposite? Does it do damage to your analogy that you've carefully constructed?
I think you've brought up one point where the metaphor does actually break down because we do have that difference, right? That this one is mitigated by social contact, and the virus, the coronavirus in particular, is spread by social contact. That's one, you could say, limitation to the metaphor. But I'm also using contact itself in the form of contact theory as one means of protecting ourselves from this virulent social disease. And so you can think of that contact in the same metaphor as the mask we wear. This is one means of protecting ourselves and our society from the spread of racism, whether it is symptomatic or not. Hopefully that makes sense. Did that answer your question?
That's an entirely adequate response. Thank you. I'm just thinking with this synthesis and antithesis that may exist, there may be a resolution that's more creative than either, that will be reconcile both of these points.
Yes, and you're going, I think, past my scientific side and towards my literary side. It's the best of times, it's the worst of times. It's both at the same time. Yes, that's what he was saying. So we have our tale of two viruses as well.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jack, for that great question to round us out here today. Frank, it's been just wonderful having you with us. There are a number of books that have come to mind on this. Much of what you're talking about, I think we've been talking about in this Q&A, goes to relationality. We can talk about systemic questions and governance and those larger. There are some of us in the audience that are engaged in that day to day, but most of us are really engaged with people. And it comes down to relationships. So many problems, and that's the way, God acts with us. He comes to us individually. I've often thought he didn't want to communicate by putting a big billboard in the sky and say, listen up, pay attention and change your ways. He actually came and right to us and walked with us and became us. And I think fundamentally that's going to be the switch. That's what will bring the change. As you come to us today, Frank, and we just thank you for taking the time to do it. This is new thinking and new concepts. It takes time for it to percolate into our thinking and into our processes. We will meditate and think on this, and we will have you back again, I'm sure, in conversation. But finally, before we go, you nodded yes to the medical school. Is that an acceptance that we got, or what?
No, I got 2 interviews, and they both seem to have gone well. So I'm looking forward to hearing back on that. It was from my #1 school, so that's really the only one I need to hear back from. But the other ones are trickling in. I've had a few rejection letters as well. So that's also, in my opinion, clarity for my path forward. So
that's right. All right, we will continue to pray with you and for you about that. And I'm going to turn now to Vicki and let her give us some closing comments and remarks. Vicki?
Well, thank you, Frank. It was nice to see you again and nice to have your dad present again as well. This is the 3rd time that I've heard Frank give this talk. I first heard it over the summer at my church, and Frank spoke in a Sunday school class on racism. And my daughter, Skylar, who was actually a student member of the ASA, had come to me after the class. I actually hadn't heard that particular class. And she came to me after and she's like, Mom, you've got to ask Frank to speak at an ASA meeting. And she kept repeating herself. And so I listened to the talk. And like John said, we invited Frank to come and speak at our Gordon student and Boston chapter. And so we're again thrilled to have him here today. So nice to see all of you here. We had 66 people, and it's just wonderful to see you all again. God is at work in the ASA, and it's been really exciting. And our focus has been on our members and mission, and not just surviving, but thriving in the midst of COVID. Many of you attended the Summer Something series, and despite the challenges, we're really taking advantage of the transformational opportunities that are before us. Many of you attended the October member assembly meeting. We've got lots of chapter meetings going on around the US and Canada. We have 2 new chapters that have just been launched. One is in the Twin Cities called the North Star chapter, and another called the Red River Valley chapter in North and South Dakota. So if any of you live in those areas of the country and want to get involved in those chapters, please do so. Also have a couple events coming up that we wanted to mention to you. On Saturday, January 30th, we have a winter mini conference. We're getting ready to announce an exciting speaker, so stay tuned for that. And we'll be starting our publicity efforts. We're hoping to continue these brown baggers. We had 2 of them during the Summer Something series, and we have a number of them planned for next year in 2021, so stay tuned for that. We're going to be launching our new, what we're calling Diving Deeper discussions, and those will be around articles in the journal. So our first one will begin on Saturday, January 9th at 2 p.m. Eastern, and they're going to run monthly. Randy Isaac is going to moderate those. So again, stay tuned. We're working on our publicity efforts with those. We're planning for a spring member assembly meeting. And then, of course, we're hoping and praying that we can be in San Diego next summer. We had a meeting with our planning team just this week. And so stay tuned for that. We're planning to do, again, God willing, an in-person meeting, but additionally a virtual meeting. So that's something that is going to become part of our new normal, is to be running 2 tracks of the meeting. So for those of you that can't make it to San Diego, we're going to do an online version as well. And as we're entering this season of Thanksgiving, our gratitude for God's providence has never been more heartfelt. In the midst of the pandemic, the ASA community really has responded overwhelmingly with generosity, and in the season of annual fund, our annual fund appeal, we've had many gifts, and we thank many of you for supporting us, first-time guests, long-time supporters. As you know, the annual fund is a big part of our budget, and so we're just so encouraged and humbled. And if you're in a position to give and haven't given yet, we'd certainly appreciate that. And I was reminded today, I received a Thanksgiving card in the mail, and on it was 1 Thessalonians 5:16 through 18. Rejoice always, pray continually, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for your support, and we wish all of you a happy Thanksgiving. God bless. Goodbye.